The night air on Colony 9 cut like shards of glass. Wind howled through the dilapidated streets, whipping up red dust that stung the eyes and coated the lungs. Flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows across the deserted market square as the last of the evening's patrol drones hummed overhead. Grant pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as he trudged home from his repair shop. Another day. Another handful of credits. Barely enough to keep the heat running in his small apartment. The mechanic had long ago accepted his solitary existence on this harsh frontier world. Occasionally, he would stop at the night market for a quick meal or replacement parts. But mostly, he kept to himself, finding comfort in the rhythmic work of fixing broken machines. That evening, something caught his eye in the narrow alley beside the market. A flash of movement, a soft whimper. Grant hesitated. Getting involved in Colony 9's shadier business was never wise. The planet attracted all sorts, from miners to fugitives to those running from debts. But the sound came again, unmistakably a child's cry. Cursing under his breath, Grant turned into the alley. The temperature had dropped dangerously low, even for him with his heavy coat. What he found, huddled against the wall, made his heart stop. A small, purple-skinned child, trembling violently in the freezing night. A Keith child. "Hey there," he whispered, crouching down. "Are you lost?" The child flinched, shrinking further into the shadows. Her wide, luminous eyes reflected terror in their violet depths. Grant had seen Keith adults before, tall beings with crystalline technology beyond human understanding, but never one of their children. And certainly not abandoned in a back alley on a human colony. Keith were rare on Colony 9. Most humans regarded them with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Rumors of their psychic abilities and advanced technology made them targets, valuable commodities in certain black markets. A child alone was as good as dead, especially in the bitter cold of the colony's winter. "I won't hurt you," Grant said softly, extending his hand palm up. "But you'll freeze out here. Come with me." The child stared, uncomprehending. Of course. She probably didn't speak the common language. Grant mimed eating, then pointed to his apartment building visible at the end of the street. After a moment's hesitation, hunger and cold winning over fear, the child took a single halting step toward him. By the time they reached his apartment, the child was barely conscious, her small frame racked with shivers. Grant carried her inside, placing her gently on his worn couch. He cranked up the heat, found his warmest blanket, and heated some soup, the prepackaged kind that tasted like nothing but at least contained nutrients. The girl woke as the smell of food filled the small room. She watched Grant warily from beneath the blanket, tracking his every movement. "Here," he offered the bowl. "It's not great, but it's hot." Small purple hands emerged from the blanket to accept the offering. She sniffed it cautiously before taking a tiny sip, then began to drink with desperate speed. "Slow down," Grant cautioned, miming with his hands. "You'll make yourself sick." Over the next few days, a routine developed. The girl, whom Grant had started calling Luma after the luminescent quality of her eyes, remained mostly silent, but began to venture from the couch. She watched with fascination as Grant tinkered with broken drones and appliances at his makeshift home workbench. Grant had reported finding her to colony security, but as expected, they showed minimal interest in a stray alien child. "Probably escaped when we busted that slave camp out on the ridge last month," the officer had said with a shrug. "No resources to track down her people. File a report if you want, but she's your problem now." So Grant became Luma's reluctant guardian. She learned a few words: water, food, sleep, and surprised him with her quick intelligence. At night, she would stare out the window at the stars with such longing that Grant wondered what world she had come from, what family might be looking for her. He knew he should find a more permanent solution. His apartment was no place for a child, especially one of another species. But every time he considered turning her over to colonial services, he thought of the overcrowded orphanages, the prejudice she would face, and found himself postponing the decision for just one more day. Then, one evening, everything changed. Grant was late returning from his shop. A wealthy client had brought in an expensive service drone that needed rewiring, and the extra credits were too good to pass up. As he approached his apartment building, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong. The door to his unit was ajar, the security panel dark. Grant slowed his pace, retrieving the heavy wrench he kept in his work bag. Silently, he eased the door open wider. His apartment was in disarray, drawers pulled open, furnishings overturned. Heart pounding, he called out, "Luma!" A small, purple figure darted from the kitchen and crashed into his legs, arms wrapping around him in desperate terror. Behind her came another figure, taller, older, but unmistakably Keith. A female. Her violet skin darker than Luma's, marred with faint scars visible even in the dim light. The adult Keith froze at the sight of Grant, her luminous eyes widening in alarm. She wore tattered clothing that hung loosely on her thin frame, one hand raised defensively, fingers splayed in what might have been a threatening gesture. But Grant could see how badly she was trembling. Before either adult could speak, the building's security alarm began to wail. Through the still open door, Grant spotted figures at the end of the hallway, human shapes with the telltale glint of weapons. "Bounty hunters," he muttered, recognizing the distinctive silhouettes of their modified armor. He'd seen their kind before, usually hunting escaped criminals or valuable fugitives. His mind raced. If they were here, they were after the Keith woman, and if they found her, they'd take Luma too. Making a split-second decision, Grant pulled Luma behind him and gestured urgently to the Keith woman. "Back door! Now!" To his surprise, she understood, nodding quickly and following as he led them through the apartment to the service exit. They slipped out, just as heavy footsteps approached his front door. The night air hit them like a wall of ice as they emerged into the back alley. Grant kept a firm grip on Luma's small hand while checking that the Keith woman followed. She moved with difficulty, favoring one leg. "This way," Grant whispered, leading them through a maze of maintenance corridors he knew from years of repair work. They emerged several blocks away, in a quieter, older section of the residential district. "My workshop," Grant explained, ushering them into a small, cluttered space filled with machine parts and tools. "It's not much, but it has a security system they won't crack easily." Once inside, Grant secured the reinforced door and activated the old but effective security protocols. Only then did he turn to face the Keith woman, who had collapsed onto a workbench, clearly exhausted. Luma immediately ran to her, tiny hands touching the woman's face with what seemed like disbelief. "Papa," Luma said, using the name she'd given Grant, then gestured to the woman. "She okay?" It was the longest sentence Grant had heard from her. He approached cautiously, noting the woman's labored breathing and the dark bruising visible on her arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked, knowing she likely wouldn't understand. To his surprise, she responded in halting common language. "Not bad. Need rest." Her voice was musical despite its weakness, with an accent that made the words flow strangely. Grant nodded. "You're Luma's mother?" The woman's gaze softened as she looked at the child. "Yes, my daughter." She placed a protective hand on Luma's head, fingers trembling. "They took from me in camp." Her expression darkened. "Slave camp." Grant's jaw tightened. The rumors were true then. The mining consortium on the outskirts had been running an illegal operation using Keith laborers. Colonial Security had supposedly shut it down last month, but clearly, they'd missed some victims, or deliberately ignored them. "How did you find her?" Grant asked. "Searched. Many days. the woman's luminous eyes filled with tears. Herd, child with human, followed. Grant processed this information. And the bounty hunters? Price. On Keith. Escaped slaves. She looked down at her scarred hands. High value. The reality of the situation settled heavily on Grant's shoulders. Harboring fugitive Keith, especially ones with bounties on their heads, could cost him everything. His business, his freedom, maybe his life. The smart play would be to turn them in, claim he'd been coerced. But as he watched Luma press against her mother, small face alight with joy despite their danger, he knew he couldn't do it. You need rest, he said finally. Both of you. There's a cot in the back room. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. Relief flooded the Keith woman's features. Thank you, she whispered. Then, hesitantly, name, Terry. Grant raised an eyebrow at the distinctly human name, but didn't comment. Many alien species adopted human names when dealing with colonies. It was easier than teaching humans to pronounce their native sounds. I'm Grant, he replied simply. Get some sleep, Terry. You're safe for tonight. As he watched mother and child retreat to the small back room, Grant wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into, and how he was going to get them all out alive. The night passed in uneasy vigilance. Grant modified one of his security drones to patrol outside, alert for any suspicious movement. The workshop was secure, but it wouldn't withstand a determined assault if the bounty hunters tracked them here. Morning brought a knock at the service entrance, not the hammering of bounty hunters, but a familiar pattern. Grant checked the camera feed before disengaging the locks. Mal, a grizzled freight hauler, who occasionally hired Grant for engine work, stepped inside. He gave a low whistle at the sight of the reinforced door. Nice upgrades. Expecting trouble? Grant shrugged noncommittally. Always good to be prepared. Mal snorted. Well, you might need it. Whole district's buzzing about some commotion in your building last night. Bounty hunters tearing the place apart. He leaned closer. Rumor says they're after escaped Keith slaves. Big money on their heads. Grant kept his expression neutral. Is that so? Just thought you should know. Mal glanced around the workshop. Also, my hauler's acting up again. Coolant system's shot. When you got time. I'll come by next week, Grant promised, already ushering his friend toward the door. Got a big project right now. After Mal left, Grant returned to find Terry standing in the shadows, her luminous eyes wide with fear. They know, she whispered. Not about you specifically, Grant assured her. But they're looking. We need to move you somewhere safer. Terry shook her head, a gesture she must have picked up from humans. No safe. Not for Keith. Grant couldn't argue with that. Colony 9 had never been welcoming to non-humans, especially those as valuable and mysterious as the Keith. The mining consortiums would pay handsomely for capable workers they didn't have to feed or pay, particularly ones with the Keith's legendary crystal-forming abilities. Luma emerged from the back room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked better than she had days ago, less thin, more animated. At the sight of her mother, she broke into a smile that transformed her entire face. Papa, she said, turning to Grant. Hungry? The simple domesticity of the moment struck Grant forcefully. Somehow, in the span of a few weeks, he'd acquired something dangerously close to a family. The realization was both terrifying and strangely warming. I'll get food, he said, moving toward his small kitchenette. But we need to talk about what happens next. While preparing a simple meal from his emergency stores, Grant outlined what he knew. The bounty hunters were clearly tracking Terry, possibly through some technology embedded during her captivity. His apartment was compromised, and the workshop wouldn't remain safe for long. We need to get you off planet, he concluded. Both of you. Terry shook her head again, more forcefully. No ships. Take Keith. Not without owner papers. She was right. Interstellar transport required documentation, species identification, citizenship or work permits, health clearances. Without them, no legitimate transport would take them, and illegitimate ones were even more dangerous than staying put. "Then we need to get you those papers," Grant said, thinking aloud. "There's a judge in the Eastern District, Elliot. He's known for supporting refugee cases. If we could get to him, explain the situation." Terry's expression remained doubtful, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope. Perhaps. She reached out hesitantly, fingers nearly touching Grant's arm before withdrawing. "Why, help us?" she asked softly. It was a fair question, one Grant had been asking himself. He looked at Luma, who was contentedly devouring her breakfast, and felt something twist in his chest. "Because it's right," he said simply, "and because she deserves a chance." Terry followed his gaze to her daughter. "Yes," she agreed, her voice stronger than before. "She deserves everything." Their planning was interrupted by a harsh beeping from Grant's security console. He rushed to check the display and cursed under his breath. Motion sensors on the back alley had detected multiple figures moving with the distinctive formation of trained hunters. "They found us," he said grimly, grabbing his tool bag. "We need to go, now." Grant led them to a narrow maintenance hatch in the workshop floor, an access point to the colony's sprawling underground infrastructure. Colony 9 had been built in phases, with newer systems often laid over old ones, rather than replacing them. The result was a labyrinthine network of tunnels, most forgotten by all but the maintenance workers. "I did repairs down here for years," Grant explained, as he helped Terry and Luma down the rusty ladder. "Not many people know these routes. We can use them to reach the Eastern District." The tunnels were cold, damp, and dimly lit by sporadic emergency lighting. Water dripped from corroded pipes, and the air smelled of mold and stagnation. Grant led the way, portable lamp illuminating their path, while Terry carried Luma, who had grown quiet with fear. They had traveled perhaps half a kilometer when a distant sound echoed through the tunnels, the metallic clang of another access hatch opening. "They're following," Terry whispered, clutching Luma tighter. Grant nodded grimly. "They must have tracking technology we don't know about." He considered their options. The main tunnel continued ahead, but there was a smaller offshoot to their right, an older service passage that might provide temporary shelter. "This way," he decided, guiding them into the narrower tunnel. It ended in a small maintenance room, long abandoned judging by the dust. Old control panels lined one wall, their displays dark and dead. Grant secured the door behind them and quickly assessed the space. No other exits. If the hunters tracked them here, they'd be trapped. "Papa," Luma whispered, tugging at his sleeve. She pointed to one of the panels, her eyes wide. "Light." Grant followed her gaze. One of the panels showed a faint glow, not electrical, but a soft, crystalline luminescence emanating from behind the metal casing. Terry gasped, moving closer. "Keith work," she said, tracing glowing symbols barely visible beneath years of grime. "Old, very old." Grant watched in fascination as Terry placed her palm against the panel. The glow intensified, responding to her touch. Sections of the wall slid aside, revealing a hidden passage illuminated by the same crystalline light. "What is this?" Grant asked, astonished. "Keith, we're here. Before humans." Terry's eyes reflected the soft light. Built, deep places, forgotten. Without further explanation, she guided Luma into the passage. Grant followed, pulling the panel closed behind them, just as footsteps echoed in the tunnel outside. The hidden passage led them deeper into Colony 9's forgotten substructure. Unlike the human-built tunnels, these corridors were smooth, curving organically, their walls embedded with crystalline formations that provided gentle illumination. The air was noticeably warmer and drier. "I had no idea," Grant murmured, taking in the alien architecture. "How did you know?" Terry's expression was distant, remembering. "Stories. From elders. Keith helped build first colonies. Then, pushed away. Forgotten." She ran her fingers along a crystal formation. "Our work remains." They continued through the Keith passages for what felt like hours. Luma seemed to gain energy from the familiar environment, pointing excitedly at various crystal formations and chattering in what must have been her native language. Terry responded in kind, their musical exchanges echoing softly through the tunnels. Grant felt a pang of exclusion watching them together, then immediately chided himself for the selfishness of the feeling. Of course, they should reconnect in their own language. He was just the human who had temporarily sheltered them, nothing more. Eventually, the passage began to slope upward, and the quality of the light changed. Terry paused, placing a warning hand on Grant's arm. "Near surface," she whispered. "Must be careful." A panel, similar to the one they'd entered through, marked what appeared to be an exit. Terry examined it, tracing symbols with practiced fingers. The panel slid aside, revealing not the colony's streets as Grant had expected, but the interior of an abandoned building. Dust-covered furnishings and equipment suggested it had once been some kind of research facility. Large windows, now boarded up, lined one wall. Through gaps in the boards, Grant could see they were in the Eastern District, recognizable by the distinctive architecture of the colony's original settlement. "Perfect," he said, allowing himself a moment of relief. "Judge Elliott's offices are just a few blocks from here." Terry remained tense, scanning the abandoned facility. "Not safe yet," she cautioned. "Hunters. Persistent." As if summoned by her words, a faint, beeping sound cut through the silence. Grant froze, then frantically began checking his clothing and equipment. "They must have tagged us somehow," he muttered, finding nothing. Terry's face paled, her hand moving to her neck. With trembling fingers, she probed beneath her collar, wincing as she extracted a tiny metallic disc no larger than a fingernail. "Slave tracker," she whispered, horror and shame mingling in her voice. "Thought. Removed all." Grant took the device, examining it briefly before crushing it beneath his boot. "It doesn't matter now. They already know our location. We need to move, quickly." They exited the abandoned facility through a service door, emerging into the chilly morning air of the Eastern District. The streets were busier here than in Grant's neighborhood, with workers and merchants beginning their day. The increased foot traffic provided some cover, but also meant more eyes that might recognize them, especially Terry and Luma, whose violet skin stood out starkly among the predominantly human population. Grant led them through back alleys and service corridors, avoiding main thoroughfares. He'd borrowed lab coats from the abandoned facility, which helped conceal their appearances somewhat, but it was a flimsy disguise at best. Judge Elliott's office was located in a modest building near the district courthouse. As they approached, Grant noticed increased security, not just the usual drones, but human guards with scanning equipment. "Something's wrong," he murmured, pulling them back into a recessed doorway. "That level of security isn't normal." Terry clutched Luma close, eyes wide with fear. "They warned him. About us." Grant's mind raced. If the bounty hunters had alerted authorities, their chances of receiving help from the justice system had just plummeted. Judge Elliott might be sympathetic to refugee cases, but not if he believed Terry was a dangerous fugitive. A public announcement screen on a nearby building flickered to life, displaying the colony's emergency broadcast system. Grant's heart sank as he saw their images. Blurry security footage from his apartment building, but recognizable nonetheless. The scrolling text declared them persons of interest in connection with dangerous fugitives. "We've been framed," Grant said grimly. "The hunters must have connections in security." Terry's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over her features. "No escape," she whispered. never escape. Grant refused to accept that. There's always a way, he insisted, though his confidence was wavering. We just need to rethink our approach. As they huddled in the doorway, considering their dwindling options, Luma tugged at her mother's coat. "Mama," she said urgently, pointing down the alley. "Look." A figure was approaching, an elderly woman wrapped in a threadbare coat. As she drew closer, Grant tensed, ready to run. But something in her demeanor gave him pause. She wasn't moving with the purposeful stride of security or bounty hunters, but rather the unhurried gait of someone simply going about their business. The woman stopped a few paces from them, her wrinkled face impassive as she studied their huddled forms. "You're the ones they're looking for," she said. It wasn't a question. Grant stepped slightly forward, shielding Terry and Luma with his body. "We haven't done anything wrong." The old woman's gaze shifted to the Keith mother and child, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Keith," she murmured, "haven't seen your kind in years." She glanced back at Grant. "They're saying you kidnapped them." "That's a lie," Grant replied firmly. "They escaped from slavers. The bounty hunters want to take them back." The woman was silent for a long moment, then nodded once. "I thought as much. The official story seemed convenient." She gestured for them to follow. "Come with me. Quickly now." Grant hesitated, wary of trusting a stranger, but their options were rapidly dwindling. Terry met his questioning look with a slight nod. The old woman led them through a series of increasingly narrow alleys, eventually stopping at a nondescript door set into a crumbling wall. She entered a code on a worn keypad, and the door slid open to reveal a small, cluttered living space. "It's not much," she said, ushering them inside. "But the walls are thick and the neighbors mind their own business." Once the door was secured behind them, the woman introduced herself simply as Eliza. She had been a scientist, she explained, in the early days of Colony 9 settlement. She'd worked alongside Keith specialists, before human-Keith relations had soured, and most Keith had departed or been forced into labor camps. "They were brilliant," Eliza said, her eyes distant with memory. "Their crystal technology was decades beyond our understanding. We could have learned so much from them if fear and greed hadn't won out." She provided them with food and clean clothing, setting up a small sleeping area for Luma in what appeared to be a storage room. The child fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from their ordeal. In the main room, Eliza spread out a faded map of the colony on her table. "The eastern port might be your best option," she said, indicating a section near the colony's edge. "Small craft come and go with minimal documentation checks. If you can find a sympathetic pilot." Grant studied the map. "That's at least 10 kilometers from here, through heavily monitored sectors." "There are ways," Eliza replied, tracing alternative routes with a gnarled finger. "Maintenance tunnels, old transit lines. I've spent decades mapping this colony's forgotten spaces." Terry had been quiet, watching their exchange with attentive eyes. Now she spoke. Her common language noticeably improved with practice. "Why help us? Risk. For strangers." Eliza's weathered face softened. "I had a Keith colleague once. A friend. When the purges came. I did nothing." She glanced toward the room where Luma slept. "Some mistakes you can never fix. But perhaps you can still atone for them." Later that night, as Terry sat beside her sleeping daughter, Grant joined her in the small room. The Keith woman looked up at his approach, her luminous eyes reflecting the dim light. "She is peaceful," Terry said softly, stroking Luma's hair. "First time since camp." Grant nodded, settling beside her on the floor. "She's resilient. Kids often are." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Luma's gentle breathing. Finally, Terry spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I left her. In camp. The admission seemed torn from her, painful and raw. Had no choice. Guards separating, mothers from children. Said, "Work better alone." Her hands trembled in her lap. Promised I would return. But took so long. Grant reached out hesitantly, covering her trembling hands with his own. You did return. That's what matters. Terry's gaze remained fixed on Luma. Found her. Because of you. Good human. She turned her hands to clasp his, her touch surprisingly warm. Thank you for being her papa. The simple gratitude in her voice made Grant's throat tighten. I didn't do much, he demurred. Just what anyone would do. Terry shook her head. Not true. Many humans would not help Keith Child. She squeezed his hand gently. You. Special. Grant felt warmth spread through him at her words. Uncomfortable with the praise, yet undeniably moved by it. This strange, impromptu family they'd formed, human, Keith mother, Keith child, defied all colonial conventions. Yet, somehow, it felt more right than anything in his solitary existence had for years. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a soft chime from the main room, Eliza's security system. They exchanged alarmed glances before hurrying to investigate. Eliza was already at her monitoring station, face grim as she studied the display. Patrol drones, she reported, scanning the district, more than usual. Grant peered at the screen, noting the systematic pattern of the search. They're being thorough, house by house. They must have narrowed down our location, Terry said, fear evident in her voice. Eliza turned to them, decision clear in her aged eyes. You need to leave, now. Take the tunnel route we discussed. She moved quickly for her age, gathering supplies into a small pack. Food, water, a portable heater, basic medical supplies. The tunnels will be cold, she explained, handing the pack to Grant. Especially the older sections. Terry retrieved Luma, who remained drowsy but cooperative as she was bundled into warmer clothing. The child seemed to understand the urgency, remaining quiet as preparations were made. Eliza led them to what appeared to be a storage closet, but revealed a hidden access panel behind shelving. This connects to the old transit maintenance system, she explained. Follow it east for 2 kilometers, then look for the blue marker. That passage leads to the port district. As they prepared to descend, Terry embraced the old woman briefly. Thank you, she whispered. Eliza nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. Find a better place, she replied. For all of you. The maintenance tunnels were as cold as Eliza had warned, colder even than the previous passages they'd navigated. Their breath fogged in the chilled air as Grant led the way, portable lamp illuminating the narrow corridor. Luma rode on Terry's back, small arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour when a distant sound echoed through the tunnel, the mechanical whir of a drone. They're in the system, Grant whispered, dousing their lamp. Stay close to the wall. They pressed themselves into a recessed maintenance alcove, barely breathing as the drone's lights swept past their position. It paused, sensors scanning, before continuing down the main passage. That was too close, Grant muttered once the drone was gone. They must be monitoring all exit routes. Terry's expression was resolute despite her fear. Must keep going, for Luma. They proceeded with increased caution, using the lamp only when absolutely necessary, and listening intently for any sounds of pursuit. The blue marker Eliza had mentioned appeared eventually, a faded stripe on the tunnel wall, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. The passage it indicated was older, narrower, descending deeper beneath the colony. The air grew warmer as they progressed, humid with the heat of geothermal vents that had powered the colony's earliest systems. We must be near the original settlement foundation, Grant observed, noting the change in construction. These tunnels predate modern Colony 9. Terry nodded, running her fingers along the wall. Feel Keith work, she said. Crystal foundation. They emerged eventually into a larger chamber, clearly Keith in design, with organic curves and crystalline formations embedded in the walls. The crystals glowed faintly, providing enough light for them to extinguish their lamp. Rest here, Grant suggested, noting Terry's fatigue. Just for a little while. They settled in a corner of the chamber, sharing the food Eliza had provided. Luma seemed fascinated by the crystal formations, touching them reverently and whispering in her native language. She says, they sing, Terry translated, smiling softly at her daughter's wonder. Keith crystals, store memory, knowledge. Grant watched as Luma pressed her ear to a particularly large formation, her expression one of intense concentration. What kind of knowledge? History, science, stories. Terry's voice took on a wistful quality. My people were scholars once, before humans made us workers. The bitterness in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Grant found himself wondering about the Keith homeworld, about the culture that had created such beautiful, functional architecture. How much had been lost when they were reduced to their labor value? Their rest was cut short by a distant echo. Voices, human voices, reverberating through the tunnels. They followed us, Grant said grimly, gathering their belongings. We need to move. Terry lifted Luma, who clung to her mother with wide, frightened eyes. Which way? Grant hesitated. The passage continued ahead, but there was no guarantee it led to the port, as Eliza had suggested. The voices were growing louder, multiple pursuers, judging by the echoes. Papa, Luma whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. She pointed to one of the crystal formations, a cluster that seemed to pulse with slightly brighter light than the others. Terry followed her daughter's gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. Keith Path, she breathed. Luma feels it. Without further explanation, Terry approached the crystal cluster, placing her palm against its surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft grinding sound, a section of the wall receded, revealing another hidden passage. Grant stared in amazement. How did she know? Keith children. More sensitive, Terry explained hurriedly, already guiding Luma into the passage. Feel crystal energy better than adults. They entered the hidden passage just as flashlight beams appeared at the chamber's entrance. Grant pulled the wall closed behind them, praying the mechanism wasn't visible from the other side. This new tunnel was different from the others, smoother, clearly designed for transit rather than maintenance. It sloped gently upward, curving in what Grant estimated was an easterly direction. This might actually lead to the port, he whispered hopefully. They proceeded as quickly as caution allowed, aware that their pursuers might discover the hidden entrance at any moment. The tunnel's crystalline illumination grew brighter as they advanced, suggesting they were approaching another Keith structure. After what seemed like hours, but was probably less than one, the passage ended at another panel similar to the entrance. Terry activated it with a touch, and they emerged into what appeared to be an abandoned storage facility. Crates and containers, long forgotten, gathered dust in the dim space. A small window near the ceiling provided their first glimpse of the outside world, and confirmation they had indeed reached the port district. The distinctive loading cranes of the eastern port were visible against the night sky, perhaps half a kilometer away. We made it, Grant breathed, relief washing over him. Now we just need to find a ship willing to take you. Terry's expression remained guarded. Still dangerous? Port security. We'll check papers. She was right. Of course. The port might be less regulated than the main spaceport, but there would still be identity checks, especially with an alert for fugitives active in the colony. As they considered their options, a mechanical hum from the far side of the storage facility froze them in place. A loading drone, its sensors sweeping methodically across the space. It hadn't detected them yet, but its pattern would bring it their way within minutes. "Back," Grant whispered, pulling them toward the tunnel entrance. But before they could retreat, the panel sealed itself with a decisive click. They were trapped. Grant frantically searched for another exit while Terry huddled with Luma behind a stack of crates. The drone continued its methodical sweep, drawing inexorably closer to their position. Finally, Grant spotted a service door partially hidden behind fallen shelving. He gestured silently to Terry, and they crept toward it, careful to remain in the drone's blind spots. The door was locked, its electronic panel dark with age. Grant examined it quickly, identifying the mechanism as an older model he'd repaired in the past. With practiced fingers, he removed the panel cover and manipulated the internal wiring. After 10 seconds that felt like hours, the lock disengaged with a soft click. They slipped through just as the drone's sensors swept over their previous hiding place. Beyond the door lay a narrow alley between storage facilities, dimly lit and mercifully empty. "This way," Grant whispered, pointing toward the lights of the port visible at the alley's end. They moved cautiously through the port district's back passages, avoiding the main thoroughfares where security would be heaviest. The eastern port was primarily a cargo facility, with smaller vessels loading and unloading materials for Colony 9's industries. Workers moved about, focused on their tasks, and paying little attention to three more shadows in the night. Grant's goal was the independent docking area, where freelance haulers and traders operated with minimal oversight. If anyone might be willing to transport undocumented passengers, it would be the frontier pilots who worked the edges of regulated space. As they approached the docking area, Grant pulled them into the shadow of a fuel depot. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll find someone who might help." Terry caught his arm, her luminous eyes filled with concern. "Dangerous? For you. Already risked. Too much." Grant covered her hand with his own. "I'm already a wanted fugitive," he pointed out with a wry smile. "Might as well go all the way." Before she could protest further, he slipped away into the bustle of the docking area. Terry huddled with Luma in the shadows, watching the various vessels being loaded and unloaded with nervous vigilance. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Workers came and went. Security drones made occasional passes overhead. Luma grew restless, though she remained admirably quiet, seeming to understand the need for stealth. Just as Terry was beginning to fear the worst, Grant reappeared, his expression grim but determined. "I found someone," he said quietly. "A hauler captain named Soren. He's willing to take you as far as Proxima Station. From there, you can find transport to the free colonies in the outer systems." Relief washed over Terry's features. "When?" "Now. His ship leaves in 30 minutes. Grant hesitated, then added, "It won't be comfortable. You'll have to travel in a modified cargo container. Limited air, no amenities." Terry nodded without hesitation. "Better than slavers." Grant led them through a circuitous route to a smaller docking bay where a battered cargo vessel was being loaded. The captain, a weathered human with cybernetic eye enhancements, waited beside an unremarkable container near the vessel's loading ramp. "These are the ones?" he asked Grant gruffly. "Yes, you'll get them to Proxima safely." The captain grunted an affirmative. "Half now. Half when confirmation comes from my contact at the station." He glanced at Terry and Luma with an unreadable expression. "Containers modified. Air for 3 days. Emergency rations. Not pretty, but you'll survive." Terry bowed slightly, a gesture of respect. "Thank you, Captain." The man seemed momentarily taken aback by the formality, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes. Then we seal you in and load the container." He moved away to oversee the final loading preparations, leaving the three of them alone for their goodbye. An uncomfortable silence fell. Grant looked at Luma, who gazed back with her luminous eyes, now filled with understanding beyond her years. She had grown so much in the short time he'd known her, from a terrified, silent child to a resilient, observant young being. "Luma," he said softly, crouching to her level. "You're going somewhere safe now, with your mother." The child nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her small arms around his neck. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered in his ear. Grant's throat tightened painfully as he returned her embrace. "Be good for your mother," he managed. When Luma released him, he stood to face Terry. The Keith woman's expression was complex: gratitude, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. "All credits I had gave to Captain," Grant explained awkwardly. "Should be enough to get you settled somewhere safe." Terry shook her head. "Cannot repay what you did." "You don't need to," Grant assured her. "Just live well, both of you." Terry stepped closer, her luminous eyes searching his face. "You could come," she suggested hesitantly. "With us." Grant's heart lurched at the unexpected offer. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it, leaving Colony 9 behind, starting fresh in the outer systems with Terry and Luma. A real family, not just the accidental, temporary arrangement they'd stumbled into. But reality asserted itself quickly. "I can't," he said regretfully. "If I disappear too, they'll know I helped you escape. They might keep searching. This way, I can stay, mislead them, make sure they believe you went in a different direction." Terry's disappointment was visible, but she nodded in understanding. "Wise," she acknowledged, "but we'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," Grant admitted, surprised by how deeply he meant it. "Both of you." The captain returned, his expression brooking no further delay. "Time to go." Terry took Luma's hand and moved toward the container. At the last moment, she turned back to Grant. "If someday," she began uncertainly. "If safe again." "I'll be here," Grant promised. "Or I'll find you. Somehow." With a final nod, Terry and Luma entered the container. The captain sealed it efficiently, then signaled to the loading crew. Grant watched as the container was elevated and secured in the vessel's hold, a small part of an unremarkable cargo that would attract no special attention. The ship departed 20 minutes later, rising into Colony 9's night sky with a low rumble of engines. Grant watched until it was just another pinpoint of light among the stars, then turned to face his new reality, a fugitive in the colony he'd called home for years. He would need to disappear, at least until the search died down, change his appearance, perhaps his identity, find new work, somewhere away from his usual haunts. It would be a difficult, lonely existence. Yet, as he made his way cautiously from the port, Grant felt lighter than he had in years. He had helped save 2 lives, had been, for a brief time, part of something that mattered more than his solitary routine of work and survival. And perhaps, someday, if fortune favored them all, he might see them again. 3 years passed with the grinding slowness of exile. Grant had relocated to Colony 9's northern district, adopting the identity of a reclusive technical consultant who worked primarily through digital channels. His appearance had changed: longer hair, a beard, subtle facial modifications that were expensive but worth the anonymity they provided. The hunt for the fugitive Keith had eventually subsided, becoming just another unresolved case in colonial records. Grant had weathered several close calls in the early months, but his caution and new identity had gradually granted him a measure of security. He thought of Terry and Luma often, wondering where they had settled, whether they had found the safety they sought. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, he remembered Terry's last words to him, the unfinished promise of someday. In darker moments, he acknowledged the unlikelihood of their paths ever crossing again. Then, on an unremarkable evening as Grant returned to his small apartment, He noticed the security panel beside his door glowing with an unusual pattern. Someone had accessed it recently, and not by force, but with the correct codes. Cautiously, repair tool in hand for defense, Grant entered his apartment. The lights were dimmed, but he could sense a presence in the main room. He moved silently toward the kitchen, reaching for the hidden stunner he kept for emergencies. "Grant!" The voice froze him in place. Musical, familiar despite the years, its accent much improved. He turned slowly toward the source. Terry stood by the window, her tall form silhouetted against Colony 9's night sky. She looked different, healthier, more confident, dressed in well-made clothing rather than the tattered garments of their first meeting. "You came back," Grant said, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief warring with joy. She nodded, stepping into the light. "Promised. Someday." Her common language was nearly perfect now, the hesitations almost gone. "Took longer than hoped." Grant moved toward her slowly, hardly daring to believe she was real. "Luma," he asked, glancing around the apartment. "Safe. With friends." Terry's luminous eyes held his. "Wanted to see you first. Make sure it was truly safe to return." "The bounty hunters?" "Gone." The slave consortium was dismantled. The outer colonies have stronger protections now for Keith refugees. She paused, then added, "I testified before the Interplanetary Council. My face was on video feeds across 12 systems." Grant's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're famous?" A small smile curved Terry's lips. "For a time. Now, just another refugee success story." Her expression grew more serious. "But my testimony helped change policies, made it safer for others." Pride swelled in Grant's chest. "You did that. You and Luma." "We had help," Terry said softly. "A human who risked everything for strangers." They stood in silence for a moment. The years between them, both vast and insignificant. Grant took another step closer, close enough now to see the fine details of her face, the same, yet subtly changed by time and experience. "Why did you really come back?" he asked quietly. Terry's gaze was unwavering. "Luma never forgot her papa. Asks about you often." She hesitated, then continued with careful precision. "And I never forgot either." The admission hung between them, weighted with possibility. Grant found himself remembering the brief, intense connection they had formed during their ordeal, the trust and understanding that had transcended their different species and backgrounds. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends," Terry replied. "Colony 9 is changing. The new administration has granted amnesty to political fugitives. Your record has been cleared." She paused, gathering courage for her next words. "We have a home now. On Proxima. Small, but good. Luma has school. Friends. I work with Crystal Technologies, teaching others." Grant waited, sensing there was more. "There is room for you," Terry said finally, "if you wish to come." The offer he had once regretfully declined was being extended again, a second chance at the family they had almost formed. Grant found himself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the possibility. Terry misinterpreted his silence. "Understand if you cannot. Have built life here. Just thought." "Yes," Grant interrupted, the word emerging with absolute certainty. "Yes, I want to come with you." Relief and joy transformed Terry's features. She closed the remaining distance between them, her hand reaching out to touch his face with gentle wonder. "Hoped you would say that." Grant covered her hand with his own, the warmth of her touch anchoring this moment in reality. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow. Transport waiting." Her eyes searched his. "Enough time to settle affairs here?" Grant laughed softly. "I've been half-packed for 3 years," he admitted. "Just in case." The next morning found them at the eastern port once again, this time as legitimate passengers with proper documentation. Luma was waiting by the transport, bouncing with excited energy. She had grown taller, her childish features maturing, but her luminous eyes were unchanged as they lit up at the sight of Grant. "Papa!" she cried, running to him with uncomplicated joy. "You came!" Grant knelt to receive her embrace, his heart so full it threatened to burst. "Of course I did," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "I promised, didn't I?" As the transport lifted off, carrying them away from Colony 9, Grant watched the landscape of his former home recede beneath them. Terry sat beside him, her hand finding his in the space between their seats. Luma chattered excitedly about their home on Proxima, about the friends Grant would meet, the work he might do. Terry leaned closer, her voice for his ears alone. "After adopting her alien child," she said with gentle humor, the mother softly asked, "Can I stay with you too?" Grant turned to meet her gaze, understanding the reference to their first desperate days together. "And now the father finally gets to answer," he replied, squeezing her hand. "Yes, always yes." As Colony 9 disappeared beneath the clouds, Grant felt the last weight of his solitary existence lift away. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but one filled with the promise of family, unconventional, unexpected, and more precious than anything he had ever known. The transport accelerated into the upper atmosphere, carrying them toward the stars and home.